And right, so let's start, Pen.
Yeah, let's do it.
I must admit, it gave me quite a start to realize that I've known our guest today for over 26 years, during which time my admiration for him has steadily grown. Pen Haddow is an exciting package, the real deal of Arctic explorer, environmentalist, and conservationist. He's also an author, public speaker, and life coach. Ever since I met him back in 1996, I recognized Pen as a man with a mission, at the epicenter of which lies the Arctic. His innate sense of purpose has evolved from fulfilling his own personal mission to one of global implications to protect our planet for future generations. The zenith of the former was achieving an iconic world first, salute, in becoming the first person in the world to ski, clamber, and swim to the North Pole from Canada. Interestingly, behind this extraordinary feat lies a story that encapsulates purpose, passion, and a sled load of grit. For Pen had already chalked up 2 earlier attempts, and it was after 15 years of trying that you ultimately reached the pole, which gives us a clue that this is not a man to give up easily. This landmark achievement saw Pen splashed across the world's front pages of the newspapers and forged his name of one of our leading polar explorers. However, for Pen, it was only the beginning of what was to evolve into a greater mission. Putting aside all stakeouts on historical firsts, his life thereon became wholly dedicated to protection and conservation of the Arctic Ocean. His own time on the Arctic as an explorer had opened his eyes up to its growing vulnerability as the dark clouds of climate change approached. Its future was and is threatened, and with it, implications that will affect us all. So, Pen's compass needle swung towards this environmental aspect, and the Arctic became effectively his office, without any heating or air conditioning, whilst he initially led a multi-million-dollar research program into causes and impacts of the melting sea ice. Building on this, he founded the 90 North Foundation, focusing on the potentially catastrophic loss of our ice reef system of the Arctic, urging its protection by creating a protected marine area in those waters around the North Pole. Pen has written several books, filmed a TV documentary for National Geographic, been a Radio 4 presenter, made countless TV appearances. He has a string of awards and recognition, including Best Global Adventure Award, Hero of the Environment by Time Magazine, and those are only mentioning 2. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. So can I introduce you all to polar legend, Pen Haddow.
Good morning, everybody.
Pen, you are a legend. And the extraordinary thing is to think that it all began with an acclimatization training program that you were put through in your wee infancy by your nanny.
So my nanny or governess or what have you, she's in her first job, her name was Enid Wigley, and she was a Welsh spinster of great age when I knew her. But her first job as a teenager had been to look after Captain Scott's son, called Peter. And Peter was the only child of Kathleen and Robert Falcon Scott. And when he died, his mother had written, as he was dying, Captain Scott had written a number of letters, and one of them had said one of them had been to his wife, These letters were brought back 9 months later when his body and his journal that's so famous had been found, and one of the paragraphs to his wife said, "Get the boy interested in the natural world. There are some schools that see that as being more interesting than competitive sports." And he also added a bit later, "Keep the boy in the fresh air, out in the open air." And that led Kathleen, who was a very extraordinary woman, and we haven't got time to really go into that, but an intellectual Bloomsbury set, sculpturess, and sort of confidant to the government of the day, got her to put Peter through a Spartan regime to toughen him up to the cold. Less and less clothing for longer periods during the autumns, winters, and springs, which had some interesting physiological and psychological effects on Peter. Peter went on to become Sir Peter Scott, having set up the WWF, no less, and was its founding chairman for 10 years. He actually designed the logo. He was the first natural history broadcaster in the world, and handed over to the baton of his program Look to Sir David Attenborough. That's why the Natural History Unit is based in Bristol, and all the so many other conservation groups now are based in Bristol, because they used to base themselves there before going up to film him at Slimbridge, where he had all his ducks, geese and swans. And in his next job was to look after my father when he was a little boy. But of course, my grandmother had no interest in toughening up my father particularly. But in her great age, in her 70s, my father looked after, took Enid under his wing, and nominally gave her the role of helping to bring me up with my mother.
Which she took literally very, very seriously, didn't she? Tell us about the acclimatization program.
Well, basically, it's less and less clothing for longer periods in the autumns, winters, and springs, which in the Ochil Mountains around near Perth are quite fresh. The air temperature is quite fresh in that time of the year. And I had it done for 3 years until I got frostnip on my face, which a friend spotted, who just dropped by and presented this frostbite to my mother. And that was her opportunity to say, right, this stops now.
Another world record, Pen, I think, for being the youngest creature to actually get frostnip.
I think there are laws against it now, but it was all done with love and kindness. And
interestingly, that Scott connection, Joe, if we can move to the next slide, because you, Pen, sent me this visual and I was intrigued by it, because if we, well, it's impossible to, I couldn't quite decipher the words below, but tell us a little bit about this, because it is directly correlates with your ensuing childhood.
Yeah, I mean, this is a handwritten note, part of a letter. It's one of the paragraphs in a letter to Kathleen from Scott.
Kathleen Scott.
Yeah, as he lay dying in his tent, it's quite possible towards the end that his 2 comrades had already died in the tent. So he was lying next to 2 dead bodies, and he was still writing to friends, sponsors, and family. And this letter extract is from just a paragraph, and you can probably see it says at the beginning of the underline. So it's just inserted in his journal along with the other letters. Hang on, I've got to read it myself now. Something like, I'm anxious for you to for you and the boy's future. Make the boy interested in natural history if you can. It is better than I haven't got a full copy of it in front of me, but it's better. They encourage it at some
playing game station.
They encourage it at some schools, and I know you'll keep him in the open air. That was the thing they had.
Yes.
So, but Peter was, I think, only 3 when his father died, and so had no memory of his father, sadly. But he was brought up in this tough way.
First of all, because of that connection, but also because this was taken quite sort of to heart by your family, wasn't it? In the way that you were brought up then as a child, and you had it within you, this sense of adventure as a result. As I think the next visual says it all, really, with you That's actually Penn, everyone up there. Aged,
Yeah.
how old were you then? At the top of
Oh,
the,
probably about 7 or 8.
I mean, you really are at the equivalent of the North Pole of that tree. And the extraordinary thing is, Penn, that well, I'm busy writing the 3rd edit of my book, and I was told to give a little bit about my own memorable childhood moments, and it was of climbing a tree as high as I could, although with rather different consequences because I got stuck and had to be rescued by the gardener, which says a lot about both our records. Much more successful. But this, I think, reflects your spirit of adventure and getting to places where other people haven't actually managed to reach. And even from a young age, I'm saying you sensed a feeling deep within which you couldn't quite put your finger on about a mission that you were going to have to fulfill in life. And this, to a degree, continued here at school. Harrow, wasn't it, I think?
Yeah.
And there surfaced a sort of sense of, should I say competitiveness, or was it just within yourself and how that linked to sport and what you learned as a result?
I mean, I was a sportsman. I did all sorts of different sports when I was at school until I was 18 or so. But I think that I was also, in parallel, interested in doing things that were hadn't been done or were quite extreme. So when I did this, this was the equivalent of a marathon. I was aged 15 here at Harrow School, and there'd been a sort of a myth, if you like, that every now and again a boy would manage to run from Harrow on the Hill down the 400-foot hill to the bottom, then essentially along the Granion Canal to Marble Arch via Little Venice and back to their house. So several senior boys had said that they would do it, and they never did. And I thought they're just getting all this credit for we'd do it if we wanted to. And I was thinking, well, you haven't actually done it. And I thought that was really poor to sort of seek the credit without actually doing it. So at age 15, I thought, right, I'm going to do this. I trained for it, and I did it. It turned out, hilariously, that no, it was a myth. No one had ever done it. There's no record of a Harrovian ever having done it before. And I did it, I ran on my own. And the most interesting thing to me about it at the time, pretty much when this photograph was taken, this is the last few hundred yards coming up the hill before arriving at my house. And my fellow boys had come out to meet me. They'd heard that I was nearly back and ran down, was that every sort of ligament and bone in my hips and knees was aching. I was just in a world of pain. And I might add, I'd actually, as a practice, had done the full marathon the previous, not on this route, but around and around the hill, the previous Sunday. So just 8 days later, I was doing a second marathon. This is before marathons became a public participation sport or anything like that. Abby Bakila was the great Olympian at the time. He was my sort of hero in this field. But I just remember coming out the hill in pain, thinking nothing other than pain. The boys came around me and were laughing and joking and cheering. And all that went. I just floated up the remainder of the hill and back to the house. And I thought, that's very odd and very interesting. How much of this was in my mind? And that lived with me for a long time, that the relationship between mind and body.
Yes, absolutely. And an important lesson for your polar times that lay ahead, in that, I don't know, we could discuss, couldn't we, between us, what you think the ratio is in terms of polar travel. Whether it's 50-50 mental, physical, whether it's 60-40, what do you think?
Well, with every decade that's passed, sadly,
Changes, yes.
given that I did it back in 2003, the solo to the North Pole, I have come to the view really that it's entirely what goes on in your head. I mean, almost by definition, inevitably, it is all about what goes on in your head. To have the idea in the first place, to then flip that into, you know what, we're going to make this a reality. It's not just an idea. We're going to.
And actually, often, if you think about it, in all those sorts of expeditions, it takes an immense amount of courage to leap over that crevasse of unknown between having a dream and actually, you know, implementing it, getting out of your armchair of comfort and doing it. And you already were taking tentative steps in a way in terms of your first job after leaving school and university was into a similar arena, wasn't it? But vicariously living through other people's sporting experiences.
Yeah, I mean, putting it slightly different, I agree. Putting it from my end of the telescope, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do when I left university. And I read geography at University College London. I had no idea, none. I became a landscape gardener. We're putting it rather grandly. Actually, I swept paths in old ladies' gardens, front and back gardens mainly, and did some mowing and the odd bit of you know, pruning and so on. There aren't many parts of London I haven't actually covered in that way. And then one day I read an article in a newspaper, and it's one probably a series of sort of watershed moments in which I thought this article about a chap called Mark McCormack, who ran the world's largest sports marketing agency, International Management Group, and he used to come into Wimbledon to the tennis tournament every year, and it was almost like part of the calendar was, let's do an article, the press would do an article about Mark McCormack, who essentially commercialized sport. He brought in the funding for and monetized sport, in order, whether it's the athletes themselves or the teams or the events. But
then,
so
if you'd proven to yourself that you had this ability to achieve extraordinary things already by what you had done at Harrow. So wasn't it rather frustrating working with other athletes, watching there?
Yeah, it really was. I didn't really realize it at the time, but as to what the benefits were, particularly other than having a rather glamorous job, be it acting as an agent for famous sports stars. I was in the equestrian division, if you will, of this, looking after the European equestrian interests. But it was hugely valuable. I mean, it turned out to be essential training on how to raise money, to understand what rights were and how you packaged rights for different potential funders and sponsors, and how you valued those rights and how you presented the value of those rights. Because as we both know, polar expeditions in particular require large amounts of cash. There are no deals to be done with the air operators. It's just cash, which is the hardest thing to come by, as all expeditioners will know. And it kind of defines whether you get to play in the polar regions or not. If you can't raise the money, you can be the most capable in every other sphere, but if you can't raise the money, you're not going.
Yes.
So
you already were laying your foundations, even if unbeknownst to you. But you after you had a very successful time, I gathered, there at McCormack's agency, but you soon realized you had to go off and do your own thing, and you had a particular man in mind who gave you the idea to head north, and that was Vaughan
Purvis.
Vaughan Purvis, absolutely.
Let me
opened up the doorway to the polar regions to you, really, didn't he?
Well, I have to say, Rosie, he did, but it was like the second act. The first act was another of my sort of big moments. The first, a big moment had been to read this newspaper article and think, acting as an agent for sports personalities, that appeal. There was something in that I thought, I can do that, and that's really got my interest. And it was my first job application, and I got it, and I was there for 4 years, while I was there, I was becoming increasingly frustrated, thinking this isn't really deploying all that I have and all that I can be in the way that I wanted to lead my life. So I happened to go to the Royal Geographical Society library. Long story, short version, picked out a book randomly, completely randomly, read it, most of it in one lunch break. And then while walking back across Hyde Park to my office, I decided I was going to resign. I actually resigned that afternoon, and was gone within a month to basically do an Arctic expedition. And I advertised in a magazine that's long since gone bust called The Adventurers. And I asked for a radio HF operator with Arctic experience. And Vaughan Purvis, who was one of the most remarkable men I have ever met or will ever meet, saw the advertisement, and we met, and he said, look, Ben, I'm not coming on your expedition because you've never been to the Arctic, so you're not leading me up there, mate, but you can I'll take you on an expedition one-on-one to Svalbard, and we'll and the Arctic, which is a sort of Arctic archipelago of islands, the most famous and largest one of which is Spitsbergen, and we'll travel around the island group, filming and photographing polar bears from a sledger's perspective. Not scaffolded.
Yes. Now
Not
this is a picture.
Yeah, that's a classic one. That's actually for the cables in the back. You can see the guy ropes are for a radio antenna that we set up.
I was very worried because I spotted those guy ropes and I thought they might be your tent guy ropes. And I thought this is a place for comfort.
Well, they were next to the tent. I think Vaughan was just standing outside the tent when he took this photograph. But in those days, we had no satellite phones. It was all about HF radio, and he happened to be one of the world's leading HF radio operators on the world's largest ship. So he was, super expert at it and taught me all sorts of things, because that was literally the only way of speaking to the outside world. And actually, we were out for I think it was 70 days together, pulling sledges around on the sea ice between the islands.
Well, you must have learned a lot in a period of time as long as 70 days.
Yeah.
About the ways of the ice. And didn't you mind, weren't you put off as a young Turk, so to speak, by the cold? And we've got a picture here of what one has to contend with.
Honestly, as I got out of the plane, so back in 1989, this was, tourists, visitors were actively, hostilely greeted, in inverted commas. You were not welcome in Spitsbergen at the time. The whole thing flipped dramatically in the 90s, and now it's a very successful, I call it the High Chamonix of the North. It's like a highly geared up for tourism. But back then it wasn't. And as I got out of the plane and we were putting up the tent just on the side of the airfield, because there were no facilities for visitors whatsoever, and this was about minus 20 degrees, first time I'd ever been in a seriously cold world, and my ears started to burn. Then I thought, oh my God, this is a disaster. I've got sort of cauliflower ears from playing rugby at school, so they're all bashed up and not very good blood flow. And I thought, I'm sunk before we even started. I'm never going to be an Arctic person. I can't be, because my ears are going to let me down. So that was a really scary moment. My dreams were temporarily, for a few minutes, I couldn't tell Vaughan. I just couldn't say, sorry, mate, I'm getting back on the flight before it goes home. Anyway, they were all right. They didn't let me down in the end. They
survived. However, contrary to your ears, ultimately you had a problem with your eyes, which led on to a fortunate encounter.
Well, yes, you've seriously done your homework, Rosie. I'm most impressed. I think I'm slightly worried that you're going to remember things or have researched things that I have no memory of. I can't recall them anymore. But yeah, so we were, for 6 weeks, we had no radio contact with anybody, and which was hugely stressful for my parents, because of course they knew I was with one of the world's experts. So if we weren't contacting anybody for 6 weeks, something must have gone terribly wrong, was the reasonable thought. So they were very, very anxious. But in fact, the ionospheric conditions, which you basically bounce your radio waves off, we could talk to Portishead Radio in Bristol. That was who we were really linked to. Couldn't reach them at all for 6 weeks. But and then a contact lens froze the surface of my eye, and in trying to get it off, I put my filthy finger, which hadn't been cleaned properly over the weeks, out there, and then it became infected, and I was in pain, and my vision had gone cloudy. I couldn't basically see out of one eye. So Vaughan managed to, he thought, hang on a minute, he knew the frequency, HF frequency for Ranulph Fiennes and Mike Stroud, who were making one of their North Pole attempts from Canada, and we managed to reach them. And Mike, being a doctor, gave some good advice. And that set in my mind, as we flew back from that expedition on the flight, I was thinking to myself, well, hang on, I've just done 70 days traveling sideways across the sea ice with some islands in, linked to it. But it's pretty much the same duration on the same environment as going due north from Canada to the North Pole. Maybe I should be thinking about going solo to the North Pole. I've been trained by Vaughan. He was a great teacher, brilliant mentor. He taught me the art and the science, and more particularly really the strategies of how to survive and do exactly what it is that you set out to do in a polar environment, or indeed any.
You were well tutored, so to speak.
Yeah,
and
really
when
was.
you returned, you had various sorties, which included an expedition to Greenland and an inflatable, etc. But you also intriguingly set up a company called the Polar Travel Company. And this is where our paths crossed. And I remember your, then I think she was your fiancée, she's in this picture, Mary Haddow, saying that you'd set up this company.
Yeah.
And I said, what, Polar Travel Company? Well, that's going to be a rather limited market, isn't it? And then it turned out that I became one of your first clients in a way.
Yeah.
It's an expedition led by Caroline Hamilton, which was to be the first ever all-women's expedition to the North Pole. And this is us. And I couldn't resist putting this slide up, Pen, because thanks to your management of us as rank amateurs, 20 rank amateur women, what a nightmare. You managed and trained us and steered us along with 2 Canadian female guides all the way to the North Pole. It was a triumph, so much so that here we are at number 10 Downing Street. And at the center of this picture is a bit of a doppelganger, because some people might think, some people might think it's Pen as a young man, but we know who it is, but he had an uncanny similarity in looks to you, Pen. Do you mind my saying that? But they were both very good looking. So this was a great triumph, thanks to you, Pen. And you, in the meantime, and before our expedition there, had already made an attempt yourself to reach the North Pole in '94, I think. And then, am I right in saying that shortly after this triumph, you also had another go in 1998 at the North Pole, before your triumphant year of 2003. Now, this is the route that you, for the first 2 bids, were attempting and initially didn't make it. And it's quite interesting to find out what you think, or where you think you failed on those first 2 attempts.
I'm going to answer that question. I want to answer that question, but I just want to if I may, Rosie, take us back to the women's expedition, because it was a breakthrough moment for women in adventure and expeditioning. I hadn't necessarily hadn't really intended it to be, but it was intended absolutely to be that for the polar environment. I felt that bearded men had managed to, hoodwink and outpsych women and just marginalize them. It was not the place for women, and I felt passionately that was not the case. It turns out that women had 2 or 3 advantages over men in terms of the likelihood of them succeeding in any project, which we could talk about another time, but it was quite revelatory to me. And a number of careers, both within the team that you were a part of, including yourself, of course, went on to achieve great things, but also so did a number of other people who took inspiration from that whole project. So it's one of my, I'm really pleased with hindsight that we did all have a go at it and pull it off.
It's interesting, Ken. There's some things there that I wasn't actually aware of. I'd be fascinated to find out what some of the legacy was in terms of other people who went.
Oh, I had all sorts of letters over the years from all sorts of women saying this was the spark that gave them the confidence to flick that thing over from an idea that they might have had, and some didn't even have an idea when it came, just they started thinking about it. But others, it went from a dream to a reality for them. They thought, we can do this. So it was a really powerful moment, I think, and you were absolutely played a major part in bringing that all about. But to come back to your point about the solo, what did I learn? I mean, at the most fundamental level, the British have this atrocious relationship with failure, and see it as a black, a negative, disastrous, embarrassing at best, humiliating, more like thing, and worse still, that when people fail, it's kind of, well, they're but for the grace of God, and almost ha ha ha. It's almost what Get Me Out of Here, I'm a Celebrity is sort of based on. It's a very unattractive, in my view, sort of deep strand of approach to life that, and I generalize massively, but in my view, a number of British people have in business as well as sport and life in general. And actually, I would take the more of the American view, that without my so-called failure in '94 and in 1998, I could never have achieved the eventual success in 2003. And I would say that they weren't only were they not failures, they weren't even temporary setbacks.
Yes,
they were, but
they were taking you further each time.
Well,
really.
no, I go further. I say temporary setbacks were, yes, but the flip, there was the silver lining to that is that they provided the critical learning opportunities to succeed next time.
Yes.
Without them, I would never have got there. And
but
I think
also Pen, for other people to learn from, like myself, from the women's expedition, we benefited from what you had learned. And I agree with you. It's like I hold up Shackleton as an example of, well, what are you going to do? Call him a failure because he attempted twice to make it to the South Pole and didn't reach the South Pole on both counts, but I'm reluctant to use the word failure in his context, because he's become a very important inspiration to us.
Well, I think you can regard it, perhaps, failure is it's a very, very loaded, heavy word, but you could say it's a failure. If I'd given up, so I'm never coming back. Well, yes, it's a failure in the sense technically of, well, you haven't achieved what you said you're going to achieve or had planned to achieve. But actually, it has informed your life as to what you should be doing, or what you might be better at, or what you might enjoy more. And so you've learned something valuable, that this is not for you, for whatever reasons.
Yes, I think you've only failed if you haven't tried.
Yeah. Whoa.
But anyway, you certainly kept trying. And in 2003, you set off solo, and you did actually realize your ultimate ambition. So our audience here, some of them are quite well genned up now, thanks to previous guests who you know, including Martin Hartley and Anne Daniels. But can you just quickly run us through what you knew to expect from the beginning in terms of the ice conditions? And our next picture, here we are, is an aerial shot, so that people understand what is between you when you set off and the North Pole.
So essentially you have a blank map. It's a white sheet of paper upon which the only thing useful to draw are some lines of latitude and longitude in the area in the sort of vector that you're setting off from towards the North Pole. And you're literally, all you can usefully do really is tick off or mark on your positions at the end of each day as to how much closer you've got to the pole. I mean, there is no map in terms of the terrain. Of course, you're on an ocean, so there's no terrain. You're walking across a partially frozen, broken up crust of
Very
ice.
broken up though, Pink,
2
because
to
if
3
I
meters
can
thick.
sort of interrupt your flow, your ice flow there, say that also there isn't, because there aren't any maps, but rather charts, there aren't any topographical ones either. And with the next picture, when you go close up, that's how lumpy it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be like that. So that's where 2 ice flows under compression have rucked up to form this sail or pressure ridge, and there's a keel that goes down into the water as well. The rucksack is on about about 30 centimeters, 15 centimeters of snow, and then under that will be probably 2 meters thickness of ice, and then there's an ocean underneath that. Depending on how far you're out, it could be as much as 4 kilometers deep.
And these ridges, pressure ridges, can stretch up to about 50, 60 feet, can't they? And for endless miles, it seems, in the first week or so. Yeah.
So essentially, the reason that the Canadian route had not been done solo before was regarded, of the 2 routes between Russia and Russia to the pole and Canada to the pole, but as perhaps harder, is because when your sledge is at its heaviest at the outset, that is where most of these ridges are, because as the ice is moving towards the coast of Canada, away from the pole towards you, it's coming towards you, it rucks up against the coast. So there are 4,500 of these ridges that I counted on my way to the pole. And and the vast majority are in the first third of that distance when your sledge is at its heaviest. And then when you get nearer to the pole, as you get nearer to the pole, the speed of the ice picks up, because it's not constrained by the land masses that surround the Arctic Ocean. So the closer you get to the pole, the faster the conveyor belt underneath you is going, taking you backwards. So those are the 2 bigger challenges that presented by this particular route. But you never know where the ice is going to be open or closed, flat or rucked up. You just have to take it on the chin, and that is really a psychological issue, and that is one of the dominant challenges, is managing your emotional responses to this environment, which you can very easily find yourself thinking is against you. Everyone's against you. And actually, well,
I can remember in comms with you, Pen, when I was alone on the ice, with you giving me wise counsel and saying, look, the Arctic isn't a living entity, benign or malevolent. It hasn't got anything against you, because it's very easy to start thinking that, it's determined to destroy you. Particularly when you're encountering these sort of conditions, which is classic slightly further down the line, isn't it? And in 2003, after some years since you had first got to know the pole, it was the Arctic, it was all getting very different, wasn't it? There was an awful lot more of the open water, which dictated different kit. This is the sort of water which you can expect to encounter from the gullies and what we call open leads, through to the sort of kit that Penn had, which was quite pioneering. If we can do the next slide, Joe. This is the sort of kit you find yourself needing.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest sort of strategic breakthroughs that enabled me to do it was to deeply appreciate and react, deal with the fact that there was more and more open water occurring, so that in effect the route was getting longer and longer for people. And if you're solo and you're trying to haul everything yourself, to wiggle around more and more open water was effectively making your route to the pole longer. You couldn't take a straight line. By having this immersion suit, this orange immersion suit, pulled up over everything, including my boots, and having this flotation, basically like a mini blow-up boat underneath the sledge, it converted into a sort of sledge boat where necessary. I then was like, I knew it was only going to be 770 kilometers. It's a straight line route. And that is quite psychologically empowering.
And on the side there, you have a string and a sealed waterproof bag. I suspect that's a pair of isols in there, is it?
You are the first person to notice that, and I think actually
It could be a sat
I
nav,
think it's an
actually.
EPIRB. I think actually
Yes,
it's an EPIRB.
EPIRB. That's for when, in case you reach the pole when it's underwater and you have to hold it up and prove that.
I think it's because in the worst possible case, I'd be in the water with with my immersion suit on, and somehow would have lost my sledge. Maybe it something had happened to it. It had sunk. The ice had broken the flotation part of it, the blow up part, inflatable part, and maybe the sledge had turned over and slid down. I'd have to unhitch myself from it, and then I'm literally alone in the water. I still had an emergency beacon on in me that was that trace, that line goes into the breast pocket there.
Yes. Did you find I was pleasantly surprised by, after the rather scary bit of getting into the water with the immersion suit on, that it was quite pleasantly warm compared to outside, because it was a friendly -2, whereas outside it was a more hostile sort of -30, 40, whatever it was.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I don't know about you, Rosie, but I'd really have a mental tussle in my head. I would walk occasionally. I'd have to stop myself walking and believing that there was a quicker way around. I very rarely would just slip on the suit and go straight. I'd normally spend 2 or 3 minutes at least to see if there was a quicker way around, unless there was none.
Yes.
Because I didn't like getting into the suit. The suit was a faff. It was like a break in one's, easy just to keep walking along the edge, trying to find a way across. That was just easier mentally than stopping and the palaver of putting on this suit and getting everything ready and then putting yourself in the water, which I always felt to be an unnatural act, as you know better than anyone, really. It's a inky black water because no light gets into it because of all the ice. So just feels like a very unnatural act. And as we know, swimming is a social thing at the pool with friends and family or at the seaside. Very few people go out alone and into the water.
Well, there's that sinister feeling as you slither in of the pressure of the water around the suit around you. You feel as if you're being vacuum sealed.
Yeah.
And then you bob along in the water. You can't swim really properly. Fueled with concern because you look remarkably like a seal, and we all know who and what might be watching.
Yeah.
And and then that dreadful faff the other side of getting out of your immersion suit.
Yeah. Which is actually the worst, isn't it? Because you're wringing wet, and if there's any breeze, it's pretty frightening. You've got to get cracking immediately, haven't you, just to start generating some heat and pump out that moisture.
We've got some video of you actually in action crossing an open lead, so let's roll it. It's silent, by the way, everyone, so
this was actually taken in training when I was in Resolute Bay. Martin Hartley filmed this, and it was the first time that I'd used the suit and the sort of sledge boat in earnest. I'd done lots of training swimming with it in the River Dart in my suit, but I'd never gone into sea ice and been breaking my way through like this. I just hadn't been you have to be there to do that.
Yes, it's very different, isn't it, though, because you have got that high salinity in the water, which helps because it keeps you a bit buoyant.
Yeah.
But you're almost like thrashing rather than swimming, and I see you're very bravely attempting the crawl. I used to sort of go along in a kind of like a seahorse doing keeping adamantly upright in case the water went through the top of the face opening.
Oh yeah. Well, yes, it's tricky, isn't it? Very tricky. It's very marginal. The difference between whether you're taking on water or not is about that.
Yes.
That's the freeboard, if you like. It's very slight. But I think that the huge thing that came out of this image, I mean, people around the world saw this And I think it was the first time people had really seen what it is like going towards the North Pole, at this time. And this idea that look how thin the ice is. It's water. It's not a land mass. It's an ocean. And just look in the. I think people start to grasp, gosh, the difference between having it and not having it is pretty marginal. Whereas it's just a few here. It's just a few centimeters thick, but the average is about 2 or 3 meters thick over the whole Arctic Ocean over a whole year.
Yeah.
Antarctica is made of a completely different substance. It's 1.21 miles thick. And that's the average thickness over the entire Antarctic continent. And it's made of fresh water, fallen snow that's being compressed. This is not fresh water. This is seawater. That produces a very different performing substance in the form of sea ice.
And this knowledge actually was going through your mind on one particular swim when you were actually making your way to the North Pole. And it was a bit of one of those watershed moments, wasn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, you and I know that the cumulative impact of having to commit oneself to this very unnatural act. By the time I got to the pole, I had time to reflect. And certainly when I got back and started talking to people, and they're saying, you spent what, 30 to 40 hours in the water in total, out of a total 850 hours actually pulling the sledge along over the 64 days that I was traveling towards the North Pole. And
surprising percentage to people.
It's a surprising percentage. People think, gosh, and I was thinking, because people don't realize, most people simply don't, that the wider world has no idea of the speed and scale of change that's happening on the top of our planet, and how and then I started to get really interested about what is actually the speed and scale, and what are the forecasts for the future of the sea ice, and what are the wider implications of having less or no sea ice. So it started me, I had no plans, none. Part of my whole mental strategy was there is no plan B. If I fail again, or I don't get there again, there is no plan B. So I'm putting maximum pressure on myself. But once I got there, that all fell away, and it's like, right, what's to be done now?
The next slide when you got there.
Yeah.
And you'd strived so hard to get to this point, Pen, and you can see the joy, and there must have been a lot of relief. But it's very interesting because in your book, and I don't know if people can see on the camera with me here, Pen's book, I think it's one of the best written contemporary books on polar travel. I really do, Pen, because it's thrilling and very informative as well. And it's called Solo, the North Pole, Alone and Unsupported, Pen Haddow. This is my working copy. I don't know if everyone can see that. I've been cribbing off it for my own book. But I had to read because I was fascinated psychologically in what was really going on through your head. And it was far from the end, wasn't it? Because you said, I had half thought and half hope that in completing my solo journey, after 15 long years of unrelenting effort, I would have fulfilled my destiny. But in the same instant that I stood at 90 degrees north and felt the profoundest sense of relief, I also realized that the pole had never really been the finishing post. There we go. Although you were free, as you said, for the first time in life, but free to pursue your sense of purpose on a much higher level. And this was sort of on the cusp of you moving more into the environmental research and scientific side almost. Not that you could quite hang up your snow boots, could you? Because if we move to the next slide, this is one of 3 surveys you did for the Catlin Arctic Survey, along with our friends, everyone, Anne Daniels and Martin Hartley, where you were researching, correct me if I'm right, the thickness, or rather the thinness of the ice, the causes and reasons why it was melting, and also ocean acidification.
Yeah, all these things. I mean, it was born out of within a sort of over the next couple of years after the solo, I was thinking about, well, I wonder what's next, la la la. And I had another bit of a blinding moment in the bath, is where I used to get my inspiration. I haven't had a bath now for about, I don't know how many years. Well, if I work it out, I can tell you about 15 years. I've hardly had a bath. I'm a shower man now.
Yeah, yes, well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I just thought I'd fill in that detail.
That's funny, actually, because my idea to join the team for the North Pole came to me when I was in the bath too.
Well, you and I and Mr. Eureka, the Eureka man.
Trees, baths, yes.
Yeah. Archimedes, that's the chap. Archimedes, our close friend. So I thought, we've got all these skills, people like yourself, Rosie, and Martin and Anne, and 10 or 12 people around the world who can travel across the sea ice safely and responsibly, but maybe we can deploy their skills to the benefit of scientists and research, and get fieldwork done that they can't, because it's just too difficult, too frightening, too dangerous, too expensive, or just too technical. And so I put together this thing that I called Arctic Survey. And by 2007, we had a sponsor, and it was fully sponsored by 2008 with Catlin Group, as you say. And it was just to do science fieldwork on the sea ice itself, which was relatively rarely done. I mean, the people who really have done it are the Russians. They used to have ice drift stations. They'd put up a wooden shed, basically, on the sea ice, and they drift for months and months and months, even possibly years on occasion, and conduct science, atmospheric science and ocean science from those.
Well, as a result, and in your particular instance, and Anne and Martin, when you mentioned that this sort of work can't normally be undertaken by expeditions because of the weight of the equipment as well, but also the hazards, because the ice is perpetually threatening you. But here we have an instance illustrating that it's not without its thrills and spills. This is your working tent, your office.
Yeah.
And the ice splitting beneath it, which is a classic, isn't it? Look at that gully. And
yeah, so
this is photographed as it was happening.
Yeah, this is Martin Hartley image with Anne Daniels just jumping over there. This is on the 2010 expedition, which I wasn't involved with in the field. I was sort of backstage by then, organizing things. But yeah, I think it's like a massive cannon shot, as in one moment, an ice flow breaks like this. And I think they just had their breakfast and they'd been in the tent, and then bam, this terrific sound, and it starts to separate. And I think it was about 5 to 10 meters wide within about 2 minutes.
Yes, it happens very quickly, doesn't it? It always seems to be at a bad moment. I can remember having a very long, exhausting day, same as normal on the ice, and just making myself cozy inside my tent in the pitch dark when exactly that happened.
It's always the way. I mean,
I bet you wish you had a boat to hand, and your next chapter, if you would, was a brilliant idea, because it was sailing 2 50-foot vessels that didn't have ice-breaking hulls into the North Pole's international waters to demonstrate how accessible it was. Yes.
How accessible? Yeah. So. Well, up to 40% of the Arctic Ocean that is contained within the surrounding states is now open water towards the end of the summers. So it's been roughly 10% a decade, if you like, over the last 40 years. And I wanted to sort of demonstrate, that if even our little 50-foot sailing vessels can get as far north as we did. We were the first vessels in history to enter the central Arctic Ocean, the international waters that surround the North Pole, without icebreakers. No one had done that before. Free sailing in.
Which has dreadful implications, doesn't it? Because if we look at the next very striking image that you provided us with, it shows what you're talking about here, about the wildlife protection of the ecosystem in the Arctic waters against the invasion, I'd say as strong as that, of commercial shipping.
Well, I think what's happening, Rosie, is you know, as really you and I know, but that perhaps others are less aware, is that a new ocean is being created. Everybody knows that the sea ice is reducing in the summer times, but the bigger picture is that there will be no ice, or less than 10% ice, so just a few bits on the edges north of Greenland and Canada, perhaps, by 2050. So it'll essentially be an ice-free ocean in 30 years, less than 30 years. But within 100 years, there will be no ice at any time of the year on the Arctic Ocean. That is something, and people are not really aware of that. And that means that there are, sorry.
Go on, Pen.
Well, I was just going to say, so that means that the act of us, and this is driven very substantially by man-made, human CO2 emissions and related emissions. So this area has never in human history been accessible by surface vessel, and it's about to become accessible. And there are 3 sectors that are interested in doing it. And what we're, as you know, what I'm now interested in doing is, given this is the fastest changing environment on the planet, the Arctic Ocean, its temperatures are rising greater than anywhere on Earth. It's losing its sea ice, which is actually a physical habitat for all sorts of plants and animals. It's the fastest acidifying ocean in the world. The colder the water, the more acidic it becomes. So upper layers of an ocean absorb the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and create carbonic acid. So that upper layer of ocean, where most life lives, 90% of life lives in the top 100 meters or so of an ocean, is becoming more and more acidic. And a lot of species don't like that, obviously. So it's a very fast changing place through the indirect consequences of global climate change driven by human emissions. And now what I'm saying is there's not much we can do about that in the short term, but what we can do is stop additional direct threats from fishing and shipping and mining, all of which involve surface vessel activity. Let us just keep them out of the international waters of the central Arctic Ocean, which is the area about the size of the Mediterranean Sea, 2.8 million square kilometers, and it will become the world's largest wildlife reserve.
Well, this is why you've created this all-important platform, the 90 North Foundation. And Joe, if we can just move on to, that's the sort of beautiful creatures, the beluga whale that we're talking about, and fast forward to the invertebrates, the less visible, obvious ones.
You've got plants and animals there.
Plants and animals, and then this is the threat.
Yeah, so, I mean,
shocked me with that one, Pen.
Yeah, it's
just in brief, tell people what that is. It's not the Spanish Armada.
That is
the Chinese fishing Armada.
That is a local harbour's worth of fishing vessels from a Chinese port on a national holiday, celebrating their fleet. So it's not heading towards the Arctic. It's not in the Arctic, but it's a shot just to show that fishing, just to make the point that fishing is a huge commercial industry, and amongst so physically extracting fish, biological life out of waters like the international waters of the Central Arctic Ocean can happen at scale. and can
Yeah.
happen very quickly. Vast impacts can be made at very short notice. In fact, there's a voluntary ban by effectively all shipping nations, so all fishing nations, not to fish in the Central Arctic Ocean for the next 17 years or so, because everyone recognizes the precautionary principle is appropriate to be taken, which is we don't know what's up there. We don't know how important it is, what role it plays with the more popularly fished areas to the south of the Arctic Ocean. So maybe we should just back off for a bit and study it. But my work is really involved in flipping that voluntary ban into a legally enforceable agreement not to do it, not to fish there.
This you can bang your drum very loudly on the next slide. Your ultimate ambition.
Yeah. Okay. So really, what I find myself sort of at the starting end of it is bringing about an international treaty, and that is the work of the 90 North Foundation ultimately. And so my new North Pole is to get myself. This is actually an image of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and there's you can see like 3 seated positions at the far end of that stage, and then in front of those 3 positions I think there are 2 empty chairs and there's 1 chair with someone sitting in it, but just in front of them there's a lectern, a darker block there, which is the lectern, and I want to be, if I can get myself to be standing there by 2030 and introducing the plan before a signing session that agrees to create a fully protected marine protected area for the international waters of the a fully protected marine protected area for the waters surrounding the North Pole. You know, that is where I want to be. That is my new North Pole, my total focus of everything. And just as an aside, the image you can see in top left there is something that actually Sir Peter Scott found himself playing a lead role in, which is the signing of the Antarctic Treaty System, which protects the land, the continent, and the wildlife, and all sort of natural resources of that region. And so really I'm looking to Peter as my sort of forebear with Enid Wigley. You know, she looked after him, and he set up played a role in the Antarctic Treaty System. And her last charge, because she lived and died with us, my father looked after her till she died. Her last charge is going to be focused on bringing about a similar treaty for the North Pole region.
Oh, Pen, this is wonderful stuff, and we have to conclude on that note. And I think that we can all salute you as a hero, not just for the inspiration of the expeditions in your earlier chapters, but the incredibly important work that you're undertaking at the moment, because it's going to impact all our lives, but most importantly, perhaps the next generation and their afterlives as well. Yeah. So thank you for everything that you do, and please keep us informed. And now we're just going to fire a few questions at you.
Yeah, good.
First of all, somebody's saying, Angie, are there any sanctions we can apply to the Chinese?
Well, I think in the context of the Central Arctic Ocean, I can tell you that the Chinese have very serious interests, fully stated. It's part of their belt and drive. I think that's the right phrase.
Yes. Belt and bridge.
I know. No, it's a drive belt. No.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure it's a belt and drive initiative, which is a massive strategy they have for developing trade routes around the world. And a new trade route will be for them coming up, rather than going through Suez and Panama from Shanghai and other key ports where all their products are coming from to America and to Europe. They'd come up through the Bering Strait, straight up over the North Pole, and then split left into Rotterdam or right into the port of New Jersey and the eastern seaboard of America.
They've extended that, because originally it was following the land silk routes, and also silk routes and the maritime silk routes too. So
yeah, well, this is a new sort of silk route, if you like, they're looking to open up. So in terms of sanctions on China, I mean, I can't really say, but I think all I can really say at this stage is that we would hope to, we are looking to get them to agree not to use the central Arctic Ocean. So don't take this, they're not to take the shortest possible route across the Arctic Ocean. And a part of me feels they will inevitably want to go through, essentially use the Northern Sea route, which is around the edge of the Arctic Ocean. But if we can keep them out of the Central Arctic Ocean, that will be a worthwhile achievement. I don't actually think very many other countries will use the Northern Sea route or the Arctic Ocean more generally. I think most will recognise 3 of the 5 biggest container shipping companies in the world have already said we're never going to go into the Arctic Ocean. It's too delicate. We're not going to take responsibility for screwing that up. It's the least disturbed environment on the planet.
Yes, what about the Japanese have encroached Antarctic waters, haven't they, in their time?
Yeah, absolutely they have. As have the Chinese. Lots of countries, including our own, are just ripping the fish stock out of the international waters without penalty. And the great sadness is in fishing terms that up to 90%, in fact, some of it's higher than that, of the fish that are caught in these very huge nets are then thrown away because it's not the species that they want, and they're thrown back in dead. So the wastage of what other industry, there's no other industry that would accept that level of wastage. And that is a massive problem. But the Chinese have signed up to this voluntary agreement, and they're not going to fish there for the next 16 years, actually, it's just rather than 17.
Okay. Now we've got a lighter question asking whether you're going to write or have written another book.
Yes, I'm so glad. I've got so many books to write. I just hope that I'm going to live long enough to get them off my chest. I was talking in the car with my wife yesterday, and I said, there's a book that I've been wanting to write for decades, well, since 2003, really, which was The Dying Art of Sea Ice Travel. And I want to get that out next year. So I'm not quite sure what form it's going to take, but it's a sort of a nod to the fact that the sea ice is going, our world is changing. Our planet, as seen from space, is changing from white to blue at the top of our planet. What's happening? You can imagine, Rosie, if Mars, the top of Mars was changing to a blue color, the Daily Mail would be having in hysterics, and everyone would be thinking, crikey, the solar system is collapsing. What the hell's going on? And you could fly to the Arctic Ocean as quick as you could fly to Port Faro in Portugal. It's not very far away. And people are going, oh, that's quite interesting. It's like, hello.
Exactly. And yet you're first in reaching the North Pole, for instance, is probably a world last, actually.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, the aircraft are simply not there to provide the support for a long enough period in the year for expeditions because of the sea ice conditions and the atmospheric conditions it creates, like fog and so on. So yeah, it's very unlikely to be repeated because of climate change.
Well, there we go. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We could speak for hours, Pen, but I have to just throw in one lovely comment from Angie about thanking you for adopting the preservation of the Arctic Ocean as your latest goal. You are not just physically, but also morally very brave. Hear, hear.
Certainly going to take some different sort of courage, I think, for me in certain situations with certain states and government officials. Yeah.
And brave to take us all on at purpose, passion and grit as well. Pen, from us all, thank you so much for a talk that has been not just thrilling, but really informative as well. And a wonderfully important, valuable lesson, which we will all bear in mind, actually. So thank you for your time today. And anyone, I know there was an awful lot to cram into 1 hour. So if you've got any more questions, just pop them in an email and we'll forward them to Pen. Thank you, Ben, and goodbye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye. Great to,
Bye.
bye.